Well, I'm here with Matt Ridley, who's the author of the new book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes with Freedom. So thanks for joining me.
David, it's great to be with you today.
Now, I first read your book, The Red Queen, which was in college. And my goodness, you really did a good job of really sorting out a lot of the myth behind, why we have, the sexual dimorphism. Is that the proper term?
Yeah, it is. Men and women look different, and that's true for most species. And there's a deep, deep evolutionary history behind males and females looking different and behaving different. And human beings are no exception. And it's important to realize the biology that underlies that and the evolutionary incentives that brought it about. That was sort of the big theme of the book.
And then you also had another book, Nature via Nurture, which was another great book because you were able to show that this dichotomy between nature versus nurture doesn't have to be what we think it actually works hand in hand with when you get into epigenetics and that kind of thing, right?
That's right. And I genuinely think that what our genes do is predispose us to absorb the nurture, the environmental inputs that we need. So what they're not defining how we turn out. They're setting us up to absorb the teaching and other things that come with it. So, when you think about it, when you remember something, it requires the switching on and off of genes in real time in your brain to actually do that. It's the, oops, sorry, I just need to get rid of that call. It requires us to switch on and off genes in real time in our mind as we remember something. So that's an example of how it's wrong to think of genes as being nature and everything else as being nurture. It's much more a question of genes and environment working hand in hand. It's interesting that you called the book Nature via Nurture. You're dead right to do so. I'm amazed how many people interview me and say, you wrote a book called Nature versus Nurture. And I say, no, I didn't. That's the whole point. So it turned out to be a really bad title because nobody noticed that I'd changed the word versus to the word via.
Yeah, they put their old preconceived thought in there. Then the other one that you're more recently known for was The Rational Optimist, which I have to say speaks well to me. I'm someone who wants to be a long-term optimist, and I think there's a lot of evidence for having a long-term optimistic view. And so that was another landmark book in your arsenal.
I wrote that book 10 years ago, and I wrote it mostly during the great financial crisis. And so it was fairly brave to say, actually, you know what, the world's been getting better for 200 years, and here are the reasons it gets better. And for most people, it's going to go on getting better, whatever happens in the next few years. But in the subsequent 10 years, I've gone around the world talking about this, and people have always said, well, you can't still be an optimist. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. Or look at what's happening in Syria, or look at what's happening to the euro, or something like that. And of course, today they're saying you can't still be an optimist. Look at what's happening with the pandemic. And my answer is always, well, my answer is now. Do you realize that in the last 10 years, the income of the average Ethiopian has doubled? Mm-hmm. That their child mortality rate has halved? These are extraordinary changes that are happening to poor people as we speak. 160,000 people are leaving extreme poverty every day and have been for the last 20 years. These are unbelievable changes. They've never happened to humanity before. And yes, we have our problems, and we will go on having our problems, and we'll have new problems, but we will get through them. We will get through this pandemic, and we will resume economic betterment for most people. And much of it will be experienced by the poorest people. And that's really good news. So I'm still a rational optimist. I didn't set out to write that book with a huge degree of conviction. I was really going to write a book about progress. And in it, I was going to say a lot of things are getting better, but some things are getting worse. And the harder I looked, the harder it was to find things that were getting worse. Happiness was said to be getting less common. Not true. Getting more common. Obesity, mental illness. Yes, there are things that are not getting better and maybe getting worse a little bit, but weighed against the really big things like child mortality or hunger or poverty. These are incredible changes. But that book is also about how that happens, not just that it happens.
Now, the other gentleman who's been well known for making a positive case for the future is Steven Pinker, and you have similar arguments. Is there a difference that you would say distinguishes the approach that you're taking, and a major distinction?
Steve Pinker is a giant in book writing and a giant in psychology, and he's a great man and he's a great friend. And his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which came out a little bit after mine, was very specifically about the decline in violence. He didn't really address everything else, but in his newer book, Enlightenment Now, he does go into reasons for optimism about the world as a whole. And it's been fantastic being part of this crew of new optimists, I think we're called, who go around making this case. Johan Norberg is another one. Steve emphasizes different things than me, and he taught me a number of things which I didn't know. And he has this, particularly on the violence issue, he has some extremely interesting analyses of how it came about that violence declined. And I have to say, again, I thought there was more war in the world than in the past. There's dramatically less. We're living through an age of unprecedented peace, despite what has happened recently in Syria and other places. Most of the time in my lifetime, it turns out, there's been much more war going on. Africa, for example, has relatively little warfare in it now for the first time in my lifetime.
Yeah, so it seems like we are moving in a direction, and it's a trajectory that is overall positive, although it seems like the forces of cynicism and the forces of conflict are almost in a détente, always escalating to try to catch up with the good stuff, and that's why people tend to feel they look at the negative, and that's our natural instinct, is to look at threats and perceive threats and to see them more sharp or in the milieu of the jungle of our lives more than the good things, right?
You're quite right. I think it's a deep psychological thing. We worry about things that might go wrong, not the things that might go right. We take for granted the things that have improved. We bank them and forget about them. And our media plays to that, and our media exaggerates it. And that's one of the reasons why there's a strange disconnect between our extreme pessimism about the planet and to some extent our pessimism about the nation we live in, and our considerable optimism about our own individual lives. Most people are too optimistic about their own lives. They think they're going to live longer than they do. They think they're going to stay married longer than they do. All sorts of ways in which they're a little too cheery about themselves, but they're very pessimistic about the world. And that's because the media doesn't write about your own life.
Right.
It doesn't write and tell you, you're bound to get divorced and you probably will get a horrible disease and things like that. But it does write about your planet, and it tells you, that we're in trouble because of pandemics or climate change or whatever it might be.
So is there an underlying theme that grounds all of these works? You've got evolutionary psychology, you've got, looking at biology, zoology, you've got optimism of different progress. I can see a connection to that. And now your new book, How Innovation Works. Do you see a common thread in your investigations?
Yes, I do. I think the thread is evolution. Whether I'm writing about biological evolution per se or the evolution of technology, which I did in a book called The Evolution of Everything, and which again I'm touching on in this new book, How Innovation Works, I write about how most of the things that affect how our lives are come about through bottom-up forces that are the result of selection and variation. And that results in an evolutionary phenomenon whereby, if you look at the tools and the technologies that we use, they survive and become useful to us through a process of trial and error, through a process of weeding out that is directly analogous to natural selection. The good ideas survive and the bad ideas don't. And that's how we build more and more complexity and prosperity into our world. So I've been homing in on, human innovation as an example of the sort of outgrowth of an evolutionary phenomenon. And in this book, I really try and pin down what innovation is, why it happens to us and not to rabbits or rocks, and what its features are. Because and I try and bring it out through telling stories. I mean, people love reading stories. I love writing stories. And so it seemed to me the best way to tell this was to tell the story of the steam engine, to tell the story of the search engine, stories of vaccines, stories of vaping, all these different tales about how innovations came into the world, and then try and draw some themes out from them. And one of them is this importance of an evolutionary phenomenon.
How about the story itself? Is story an innovation?
You're absolutely right. The narratives have evolved over the years and will. And
what was the 0 to 1 moment where someone first told the first story? Huh? And what was that like?
Well, I wasn't there, but if you go back to Homer or as far back as you like, you can see the same themes, although actually, of course, there are differences because stories were meant to be recited and remembered.
Yeah, oral tradition. Yeah,
the oral tradition had a different pattern than the written tradition.
And those oral tradition stories sometimes were very complex, and they were passed down to the T for many, many, many generations, and that was pretty powerful. The power of memory recall that we've kind of lost because we have information at our doorstep.
Yeah, and by the way, when writing comes in, you get people writing saying this is this new technology. The kids today, they don't know how to remember and recite stories anymore. They just write the damn things down. I mean, this is ruining their brains, all the stuff we hear today about modern technology.
Have you looked at Marshall McLuhan's work about the idea that media, shapes the way our ecology? It has an extension of our human species when we have these different media?
Yeah, I have. And I think building on that idea, I'm convinced that the technologies we use for communication have an impact on the way society works. And this is quite relevant today because just as printing unleashed the Reformation and the religious wars, and the most printed author in 16th century Europe was Martin Luther, and so he's using this new technology to start a revolution against the Catholic Church. So today, social media is changing the way we communicate, the way politics works is I'm afraid, polarizing us into different tribes, whereas television on the whole didn't do that. It was such an expensive medium that it tended to sort of pull us all back to a mushy middle, if you like. Radio in the generation before that was a divisive medium, like printing and like social media, and it played a surprisingly large role in the rise of the dictators. And I write the history of Marconi's inventions in that, and the degree to which Mussolini realized that Marconi was the person to whom he owed most in his rise to power. So I think it's sort of like the Marshall McLuhan point that I think technology determinism is quite important in these areas.
Yeah, and you mentioned the religious wars. Have you engaged with Tom Holland's book? He's got that new book, Dominion, which I interviewed him about, but it talks about the influence of Christianity in shaping the way the West would go on to make some of its unique, innovations and contributions in the world. Have you engaged that idea?
I haven't read that latest book. I nearly always read all of Tom Holland's books.
Yeah.
His books are fantastic, and he's a friend. But I'm ashamed to say I haven't read Dominion yet, and it's a mistake. But I start a little bit skeptical because, sure, Christianity has shaped everything we've done in the last 1,500 years because it's not allowed any rival philosophies to have a look in for most of that time. So, of course, it would have a big influence. But if you look at the period before we became Christian, there was a great flowering of knowledge and ideas. And I write in my previous book, The Evolution of Everything, about the suppression of Lucretius, this great sort of Enlightenment poet of the 1st century AD, who really hit on pretty well everything from atomism to natural selection in his poem De Rerum Natura, and mocked the idea that we depended on supernatural beings to create the order in the world. And it was the rediscovery of his poem that played a huge part in the Reformation and the Renaissance, and influenced people from Spinoza to Thomas Jefferson to a remarkable degree. So I start from the view, which I don't think Tom would share, that we might have been better off if we hadn't gone down the rabbit hole of Christianity for 1,500 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you in your book, you distinguish between invention and innovation. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, I think invention is coming up with a new prototype of a new device that has never been seen before, whereas innovation is making that new device practical, affordable, and reliable so that everybody wants to use it. And part of my argument is that it's the innovators who are just as important, if not more so, than the inventors. We talk about the inventors too much, and we don't talk about the innovators, the people like, frankly, Thomas Jefferson. Although he would have called himself an inventor, his main job was to take ideas and turn them into practical things that actually caught on, that went viral, as it were. So he's one of 21 different people who can claim to have invented the light bulb, but he didn't really invent it. He just caught the mood of people inventing it out there and said, I'm going to make a more reliable, better one than you. And he did 5,000 different experiments with 5,000.
That's Thomas Edison, right? Yeah.
Thomas Edison.
Yeah.
Did I call him something
you
else?
said Thomas Jefferson. I was thinking.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Did I? Okay. Yes, I'm so sorry. That's a mistake. Thomas Edison.
Jefferson was a Renaissance man too, though. So
he was definitely a Renaissance man. But I meant Thomas Edison. I'm terribly sorry.
Yeah.
Somehow one does sometimes make mistakes like that. So he's a good example of an innovator, not an inventor. And perhaps another distinction, which has only just occurred to me in a conversation with someone else, is that the inventor has to understand the principles behind the thing he's developing, whereas the innovator takes the thing and can treat it like a black box. He doesn't need to understand how it works. He just needs to understand how to make it usable to people.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of inventors don't end up getting any riches from their invention. It's usually the innovators who figure out how to take this thing to market that end up usually becoming the rich ones, right?
There's a nice story told by Charles Townes, the inventor of the laser. It's about a rabbit and a beaver looking at the Hoover Dam. And the beaver is saying to the rabbit, no, I didn't build it, but it's based on an idea of mine. And I think that nicely captures the point that quite a lot of inventors feel like the beaver, that they deserve more credit, more reward than they get. Whereas the innovators would argue that, look, coming up with a prototype was comparatively easy. What was difficult was turning that into something that everybody could use and that was available to people all over the world. So actually, you don't deserve as much of the money as you think. I write in the book about the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen, which is one of the biggest industrial sort of R&D projects of all time, and about 100 years ago, and they came up with ways of fixing nitrogen from the air to make fertilizer, and it's responsible for the fact that we don't starve today. It's an incredibly important process. The inventor is Fritz Haber, but the innovator is Otto Bosch, and I argue that Haber's work was much easier than Bosch's. Bosch had to turn this insight that with a catalyst and pressure you could produce ammonia from the air. He had to turn this insight into something that would actually work on scale, making machines that withstood enormously high pressures and temperatures and didn't crumble or explode. He had to develop whole new materials to do it, new ways of building these materials, et cetera, et cetera. So his was the harder job, and he deserves as much credit, if not more, than Haber.
So in your book, you talk about, again, a lot of stories of different innovators. Is there one that stands out as your favorite personally that you covered?
Yes, my favorite, because I think it saved more lives than almost any other innovation I can think of, certainly in recent years. And because nobody really thinks about it, and realizes how clever it was, and because it's low tech and cheap, is the mosquito net. Not any ordinary mosquito net, but the mosquito net impregnated with insecticide. This came about as a result of a simple experiment in Burkina Faso in 1983, when mosquito nets were tested in specially designed huts where they could catch all the mosquitoes trying to get in and out of the huts, and measure the impact of a net on the mosquito biting rate. And they basically found that that a net was helpful, but a net with insecticide painted on it was unbelievably helpful because it acted as a deterrent. Indeed, it was so helpful that it worked even if it had holes torn in it. Mosquitoes didn't hang around long enough to find the holes. And the data was overwhelmingly powerful, and it sort of marinated into the scientific community as a result for a while, but it wasn't really picked up until the early 2000s, when the Gates Foundation said, you know what, this is the technology that could defeat malaria better than any other technology, particularly in an age when we have resistance to malarial drugs and we have resistance to insecticides, but if we're spraying them in the environment. And sure enough, it has saved about 70% of the lives that have been saved since then. And we're talking 4 or 5 million lives. That's extraordinary in the last 15 years. So that's my favorite example. And partly because when I set out to write about this innovation, I thought, well, where did this come from? You know, who had the idea? And I eventually tracked it back to 2 relatively obscure French scientists and a Vietnamese colleague and their African colleagues in Burkina Faso, and their experiment has never been translated into English. And I contacted them and discussed it with them, and so I'm proud of trying to bring that very simple little device to light.
That's interesting. Now, you talked about Edison. Now, Edison versus Tesla has become a new kind of mythology in America, and you know, at first Edison was the one that was kind of in the textbooks, but then the way our history has moved, we like to look at the Minority Report and elevate the one who we perceived was the underdog, and that becomes Tesla. So now the story on the internet is that Tesla is the true visionary, and Edison was a vindictive man who was kind of blowing up animals with, you know, using his demonstrations to scare off people to AC. What did you find out in that story? Did you look into that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting case history, and like all these things, there's truth on both sides. Yes, Edison could be a vindictive bully, and he could be, you know, pretty unrealistic, and he was wrong about DC. He wanted direct current, not alternating current, and he was obstinate about it, and he'd been so successful with so many other innovations that he didn't see that in this case he was wrong. And he employed Tesla for a while, but then kicked him out, and I think Tesla left, and then Tesla, together with Westinghouse, you know, proved to be right in the end about that issue. But I don't think that sinks Edison's reputation, because he was also the great tinkerer who worked out how to do electricity, how to do electric light bulbs. But more than that, he produced thousands of different inventions, patented millions of different things. He realized more than almost anybody else that innovation was itself a product. You could set up a factory, the job of which was to produce innovations. And he worked his teams incredibly hard. He wasn't he was a brute force man, you know, in the sense that he threw lots of people at the project rather than going off and sitting in a darkened room and having bright ideas himself. Tesla is, in a way, a much more appealing character today because he feels like a lonely genius, an immigrant, a hugely intelligent man, but he's also a flawed individual. He was a very convinced eugenicist, for example. He was not a very racially tolerant person, etc. So I think if you judge either of them by today's standards, they wouldn't come out well as people. But if you judge them by what they achieved and how they achieved it, I think they both deserve their place in history.
Speaking of another person who is not, you know, popular in our contemporary standards, Henry Ford was a friend of Edison, and just down the road from me, a few hours away, was their summer retreat where Edison and Henry Ford would hang out in Florida. Any thoughts on Henry Ford's contribution to the world of innovation?
I think Henry Ford's a very nice example of the point I make about innovation being different from invention, because he wouldn't have pretended to have invented the motor car. The invention of the motor car is a very complicated business involving Daimler and Benz and all these other different people, mostly in Germany and France, and the interplay between them, and some of them inventing one part of the machine and some of them inventing the other. And the first thing they come up with, the first devices they come up with, look like the outcome of an illicit meeting between a locomotive and a horse cart around the back of a bicycle shed, and they don't look like cars at all. But then gradually the shape of the car emerges. But what's different about Ford is that these French and German innovators had largely been thinking of supplying the elite. Mm-hmm. They thought they were building a device, a toy that could be used by rich people. Ford makes the case that no, this could be something that I bring within the reach of ordinary people. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to relentlessly drive down the price of everything, down the cost of everything. And I'm going to simplify and mass produce until I can make a Model T that is going to be something that almost anybody can afford. Along the way, he makes some pretty severe mistakes. I mean, the Ford factory that succeeded was effectively his third and last throw of the dice after a couple of pretty disastrous forays into car making. He beautifully exemplifies that it's not making a few fancy toys for rich people that counts. It's suddenly being able to drive down the price till it's within the range of ordinary people.
Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, talks about the idea that we've stopped innovating in the world of atoms, like in the world of Henry Ford's cars. And we've had this stagnation. We've had a lot of innovation in the world of bits in Silicon Valley and computer processing capabilities and the different innovations in the world of the internet. But we have had, in the last decades, relatively less innovation in the world of physical things. There basically talks about kind of what you're talking about, that Henry Ford era, all the way to get to the 60s, and we're going to the moon. And then we thought, by the 21st century, we'd have flying cars, and all we have is Twitter. That's the way his famous line goes. So do you see that, playing out?
We wanted flying cars, and we got 140 characters was his famous quote.
So do you see that same thing happening here, or do you think that's not as
Yes, I do. I think it's a really important insight, and I often make the point that my grandparents lived through the most extraordinary changes in transport. They were born before the motor car and the airplane, and they died with men on the moon and supersonic jets in the air, whereas they saw very little changes in computing and communication. They were born with the telephone, and they died with the telephone. Sure, the telephone was a bit better, but it wasn't that much better when they died. I've had exactly the opposite experience. I was born before the computer really took off, let alone the mobile telephone. And now I've seen incredible changes in those technologies. But we're still flying around and driving around at roughly the speed we did when I was born. Admittedly, we've made travel much safer, much more comfortable. It's not as if we've had no innovation, but where are the innovations that we were promised in the 1950s in transport? I found a cartoon, which is rather nice. It shows, published in 1958, showing what the future would be like. And it shows a mailman delivering letters house to house by jetpack. So he's leaping from house to house, delivering letters. Well, of course, this misses out not just the fact that we don't have jetpacks, but that we do have email. They didn't foresee that. So there seem to be two competing hypotheses for this failure, or rather for the fact that innovation has switched from transport to communication. One is that, and this is Peter's point, that there has been more regulation stifling the innovation in materials. that on the whole, we've made it pretty hard to get a license to try something new. When you're building a medical device, say, you need several years to get a permit. During that time, you say, no, I'd rather go and invent a new software program. I can do that instantly. The other theory is that we just hit some kind of limit in the physics of transport, which we haven't yet managed to breach. And we'll come back to it when we can breach it. But meanwhile, the interesting action has switched to the digital world where we can do things. I think some evidence for Peter Thiel's view of this is provided by the way regulators regulated, on the one hand, cellular telephony, and on the other hand, online e-commerce. So if you look at cellular phones, they wouldn't release the spectrum for the use of cellular telephony for decades until they suddenly started doing so in the 1980s. And if they'd done so earlier, we might have seen cell phones take off earlier. Mm-hmm. And in the case of the internet, it's not till the Clinton administration enacts some very specifically permissive regulation that actually makes it easy to do e-commerce, that the world of online commerce takes off. So it does appear that government action can play a role in encouraging or discouraging technologies.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of things of how difficult it is to challenge scientific paradigms. Thomas Kuhn talks about paradigm shifts, right? And we have this popular assumption that a scientist comes into a field and just starts questioning everything. Why is there relativity? Why is there quantum? They don't do that. They inherit the battles that have been won from the ones who won that field before, and they receive that, and they work within those received paradigms to try to further the frontiers of those paradigms or refine things within them. And but what happens is, in order to have that paradigm shift, you have to have enough anomalies to pile up, right, to poke holes in the reigning paradigm, such that at some point there's so many anomalies that poke holes in the paradigm that it's like a revolution. All of a sudden, a new institutional theory emerges that reigns supreme. I think what you're talking about with government is that government comes in, and because it monopolizes so much of the funding for science and grant making and subsidy and the way they distribute money, they're a monopolistic organism. And what happens is, I think they retard the natural paradigm shift cycle that Thomas Kuhn talks about. I think they delay. If this was more of a competitive enterprise, if nonprofits and co-ops and entrepreneurs were allowed to allocate funding in a more free flow manner without there being so much of a monopolistic force, I think you would be able to poke holes in reigning paradigms of knowledge faster and then create new paradigm shifts faster.
I think you're absolutely right about that, and it's a very interesting insight. A good recent example, and there's been some very interesting journalism about this recently, is Alzheimer's disease. The reigning paradigm about how we understand and how we are going to tackle Alzheimer's disease has been a very specific hypothesis about plaque formation in cells, and that this is what we need to understand, and this is what we need to prevent happening. The latest evidence is that the plaque formation is simply a sort of late stage symptom of something much different that's going on elsewhere, and that we're attacking the end result, not the ultimate cause. But those who've made that case have found it very hard to get funded. The funding has all gone to this one paradigm about Alzheimer's, and after 20, 30 years of research on this, with still no drug development of any significance, it's time to abandon that paradigm and look at some other paradigms, including the idea that that there might be an infectious virus involved in setting up Alzheimer's. That might be wrong, but the point is we need to, there is a good previous example of this in the story of stomach ulcers, where the paradigm was for many years reinforced by government funding, but also by the patents and monopolies on drugs, that it was all about stomach acid, and that you had to deal with this chemical imbalance in the stomach. And then along comes Barry Marshall in Australia and says, I don't think so. I think stomach ulcers are caused by a bacterium called a Helicobacter living in the stomach, causing ulcers. And if we get rid of that with antibiotics, then we sort the problem. And everyone told him he was nuts and to go back and think again. And he eventually only got their attention when he deliberately infected himself with Helicobacter, got bad stomach ulcers as a result, deliberately cured himself with antibiotics and said, "See, can you now let me try this on other patients?"
Talk about skin in the game, huh?
He really had skin in the game.
More than skin, apparently. My goodness. But that's what it takes. You got to put it all out there. And you're right. You get a lot of social pushback whenever you're doing innovation. And when you challenge scientific paradigms like that, especially when there's lots of money, and you mentioned patents. Patents are another negative effect on innovation. I think that, for example, you mentioned the Alzheimer's. I think Dr. Mary Newport in Florida would be someone that would back you up on what you're suggesting with Alzheimer's in her research. I think cancer is another one. Cancer has been primarily focused on as a genetic disease. And, Nixon declared war on cancer since the 1960s with that genetic disease paradigm. And where are we going here? But I've seen the Minority Report, which is very robust, very scientifically strong arguments that cancer is a metabolic disease. It's a mitochondrial dysfunction, right? It's the mitochondria of the cell that needs to be focused on, not what's going on in the genetic situation there. And if you looked at it that way, I'm thinking of Dr. Michael Assanti from Salford University. He's got 90,000 citations, 363 peer papers. He's become a friend of mine. And, he has used ordinary generic antibiotics like doxycycline and azithromycin, FDA-approved generics, to have tremendous effect on cancer stem cells. And based on this mitochondrial approach, it takes on the mitochondria in the cells. And, think about that. Hundreds of billions of dollars we're spending on cancer research, all going towards a genetic paradigm. But here's this not patented. So it means it's dirt cheap. You don't need government health care or private insurance to pay for it. If it's an antibiotic that costs $1, doxycycline, azithromycin. And yet there's very, very little funding in that direction to actually see that out and do the proper double-blind studies. He did an early trial in Italy where they did it on breast cancer patients, and it had tremendous effect with using a small dosage of azithromycin, also known as Z-Pak, and doxycycline. But that's an example of, here's this big thing we all want to tackle. And how much more happier would our society be if we could say, we beat cancer? Wouldn't that be a nice thing? How would that change? You talk about innovation helping us. Think about the psychological relief that us in our lifetime being able to say we have really conquered cancer, and it doesn't break the pocketbook to do it. Wouldn't that be a wonderful effect for our society?
I mean, I don't know very much about that particular story, so I can't judge. But it's certainly true that if you come along with a really cheap solution to something, a bit like the mosquito net that I talked about earlier, then you haven't got that many people with a vested interest to back you up, because nobody's going to make very much money out. Nobody made money out of the mosquito net. So let me give you another example. This guy, Ignaz Semmelweis, in the 19th century, said, you know what, in the hospital where I'm working, I don't think it's a great idea for doctors to go straight from doing an autopsy on a woman who died of childbirth fever to delivering children in the ward upstairs without washing their hands. Because this might be just a simple matter of, and that might be why the babies delivered, the pregnancies of the babies delivered by the doctors are resulting in far more childbirth fever deaths than the ones delivered by nurses. Because you're not washing your hands after doing autopsies on people who died of this disease. And so he said, please, will you surgeons all wash your hands? They were furious. He was drummed out of polite society. His career was destroyed. And there was huge resistance to his ideas, but he was absolutely right. And, you do get these Semmelweis moments in medicine. today. I suspect we're going to get one out of this pandemic. Something really cheap, might be to do with vitamin D, for example. Vitamin D. There's quite good evidence that that the people who are getting really bad doses of this pandemic are people whose vitamin D levels are low at the end of winter, which is one of the reasons that these things are so seasonal. So, that would be great, but no pharmaceutical company is going to make a fortune out of that. Vitamin D is very cheap.
And there again, that's where, free markets get scapegoated for that. But it's not free market's fault. It's actually the rigged government regulation which creates that condition. Because, in America, it costs $1 billion to get FDA approval. It costs 10 to 15 years and $1 billion investment to get a drug FDA approved. So how that de facto eliminates anything that's natural that can't be patented. Because what person would say, hey, I'm going to spend $1 billion on the finest double-blind studies for vitamin D, and then everybody and their brother can sell it afterwards and make the claim that I helped prove, So there's.
I think you're right about that. I mean, that doesn't mean that one should fall for every quack theory about supplements or everything else. There's an awful lot of nonsense talked about that too by people who.
But what happens is it retards knowledge because you can't see. The money flows towards things that can be patented, both in the private sector and the public sector, because of the incentive to say the only thing that can be made a medical claim about is something that can be patented. That's the only thing that can afford the FDA approval process. So therefore, all of the scientific double-blind studies, everything goes into that field of something that can be patented rather than looking at natural stuff, to the point where we've all been conditioned to say, if someone's saying something naturally could help you, we instantly think quack. We instantly think crank. Because, again, there are lots of those, but it wouldn't be so if there was a more free market, because we'd be able to do those double-blind studies. Because one of the things that people don't understand, and I think you touched upon a little bit, is that just because something is a market-driven thing doesn't mean it has to be obscene profit margins, because part of the market is the consumer, and consumers don't want to be sick. And they're going to drive towards a solution, even if it's dirt cheap, if that's what solves the problem. So it's not about obscene profits in a market. It's about solutions that work and the public having access to them,
No, you're dead right. And I very much in the book come down skeptical about the patenting system generally. I think it's gone far too far. I think it's largely a hindrance to innovation, not a help. The empirical evidence is very strong on this. If you look at countries around the world that strengthened their patent system, they didn't get an uptick in innovation. If you look at the equivalent in intellectual property copyright, the collapse of the ability to enforce copyright in the music industry as a result of pirating and streaming has not resulted in a collapse of innovation in music. I think we can all agree on that. It turns out that you don't need to be able to sit back and make an absolute fortune out of a song for you to be interested in trying to make a song. And likewise, copyright for the written word. If my book sells a gazillion copies forever, every year, which I hope it does, my grandchildren, if I have any, will be making money out of it 70 years after my death. That's outrageous.
Yeah.
What did they do to deserve that?
Yeah. Well, that's what happens though when, that this, I believe that's the reason why we have government healthcare, is patents. If we got rid of the patents, so government creates I know that you can make an argument for it too, but just for the sake of argument the other way, if you didn't have patents, then you wouldn't need to have government healthcare, because patents are the things that make these drugs and things so obscenely expensive that ends up forcing people to say, well, I can't afford this. I need government to save me. And as we've just demonstrated, if you can get a generic drug, something that's off patent is actually functioning much closer to way market medicine would actually function. Very cheap, and it's going to be, because anybody can make it, and that's the way it would work in a market.
Yeah.
So I think what you're doing here is very important. I want to land the plane here just by kind of getting people to see, well, you mentioned freedom is the context by which innovation flourishes. So how can we, you're in the House of Lords in the UK. Is there an appetite to do some of the things that you're suggesting where you're at, or is this just pie in the sky right now?
I wish there was more appetite for this. I think the common ingredient for all the things that are necessary to encourage innovation is a degree of freedom. Freedom to experiment, freedom to invest, freedom to profit, if necessary, freedom to try new things on the whole. And I am trying my best to encourage the British government through my membership of the House of Lords, but also other governments around the world through writing books, that what they should do to recover prosperity after this terrible pandemic and the economic recession it's going to cause is to free up innovators to get to work, to make bureaucratic decisions quicker and simpler so that innovators can try more things. And the more things we try, the more chances are we'll find good results. We're petrified by a precautionary attitude that if we try lots of things, we might come up with something dangerous at the moment. And I feel that's a mistake. I'm going to have to draw it to a close, David, because I've got to be elsewhere for another interview shortly.
Well, yeah, appreciate your time. And I think that's a good note to leave on, is that freedom is the context by which we can flourish with these things. So very good. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Great to talk.
Take care.